My name is Klaudia Lachcik and you are listening to the podcast Architektura Powinna, and today I talk with Deirdre Mask.
I remember one of the early conversations, I believe it's in the book, I had was with a South African voting official who's Black. And we were talking about addresses, and he said that his cousin had an address, and he thought that was very glamorous. And I thought that was such an odd word to use for an address because it's not glamorous, but it meant that he was living in a place where people counted.
She's a writer, lawyer, and sometimes academic. Originally, she's from North Carolina, but currently, since a couple of years, she lives in London. Today, we are talking about the addresses, street names, and house numbers. I believe most of us have never considered that such a tiny common detail can tell us so much about the place, people, politics, history. Most of us have never probably considered that the home address actually matters. But it does, and the address book that Deirdre Mask has written describe these complex stories behind the names and numbers of the roads and houses that we are living on and in. Deirdre describes the influence of the addresses, the positive and negative consequences that it can bring. And let me grab one Polish, one Dutch example. The Polish one will be about Piłsudski Square, Plac Piłsudskiego in Warsaw, in center of Warsaw. Over the centuries, the square has been named successively as the Saxon Square, Plac Saski, after Poland Saxon kings. And on the square there was also Saxon Palace, but it got destroyed in World War II, and then it got the name the Piłsudski Square, after Józef Piłsudski. After that, during Germany's World War II occupation of Warsaw, it was named the Adolf Hitler Platz. In honor of the victory in Second World War, it got the name the Victory Square, Plac Zwycięstwa. Today, it's again called Piłsudski Square, locally also Saxon Square. So we call it Plac Piłsudskiego or Plac Saski. But imagine how many names it had already during its quite short history. Why does it matter how one of many squares in Polish capital is actually named? Why do the governments want to change it? But yeah, let's move to the Dutch example. Maybe I can take the example of the postcodes this time, because the postal code in the Netherlands consists of 4 digits and 2 uppercase letters. And the letters, you might think that it's every possible combination, but not really. There are 3 combinations that you will never see in Dutch postcodes, and this is SS, SD, and SA. They are not used because of their associations with the Nazi occupation in the Netherlands. So this little detail in the names, in the postcodes, can tell us actually quite a lot about the history of our cities and countries we are living in, about the identity and the history of the place. Isn't it incredible? So the address book describes this relation with politics, with race, class, status, development, and the origin. My guest is going to answer the question, how can street addresses lift people out of poverty and transform the slums? How can street addresses help to stop epidemic? We're going to talk about a civic identity, the benefits and disadvantages of having an address. We're going to talk about the perception of space in the cities, about mental maps, how we draw in our brains the maps of the city and how it can differ, maybe depending on the culture or the language. And we're going to talk also about the trends in naming the streets. Many interesting, fascinating topics around the addresses. So, dear listeners, here is my conversation with Deirdre Mask based on the address book. 2 years after publishing, basically, now it's being published in Polish,
Yes.
in Poland. So instead of the address book, it's called Adresy.
Oh, it's great. It looks very similar to my copy there.
Yeah,
I'm holding up. Yes.
yeah. Well, thanks for being here.
Oh gosh, thanks for
Welcome.
having me.
And
Yeah.
our conversation, of course, will be based on the book you wrote. The original book was published 2 years ago, also before the COVID pandemic. So
Exactly. Yeah.
I can imagine a lot of new perception, a lot of new
Yeah.
points appeared in the meantime. But actually, the even the fact that the book gets translated and being published in
Mm.
many other places and languages already says that the addresses, it's really common, international, everyday, not really little detail, but very meaningful issue. There is this saying that show me who your friends are and I'll tell
Mm.
you who you are. Do you think we can, is it very relevant to change it for show me your address and I'll tell you who you are, or what's your status? What's the story? Could we say it that way?
Yeah, 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 yeah. I mean, it's tricky because I kind of, it's amazing to me that this is so international, as you said, because this does seem to be really important for people, that looking at your address, and even whether you have an address, does tell a lot about who you are in some way. So if you even just start from the beginning, just assuming you have an address, assumes that you probably live in a place with a fairly organized government, that can give out addresses, that's keeping track of citizens in a way, is able to keep track of citizens in a way, because huge parts of the world, an estimated billions of people, don't have that. Right, they're living in places that aren't addressed, and often that goes along with difficulties in city management and government, huge migration, often a lack of funding, a lack of tax revenue, all sorts of issues. So if you are even have an address, I can tell you a little bit about probably who you are, that you do live in a place that has a fairly good government structure. Because addressing, it's not just a matter of putting a street name and marking your door with a Sharpie marker or something like that.
Hmm.
It really is a system that governments have to keep track of us, and that's not just for the mail and the post and delivery. But it's to track you for school purposes, for taxation purposes, for banking purposes. During COVID, I think more than anything else, we saw that where we lived and where we were was extremely important. I'm American, but I live in London, and some of the lockdowns were, local, and they'd even, the legislation would have postcodes in it, or I shouldn't say legislation, the orders would have postcodes in it, so where you live becomes very important. So that's a baseline if you have an address. But once you start to get to the finer point of what your address is, it can really depend. For a lot of people, they aren't hugely defined by their address. If you live on, Pine Street, or Rose Street, quite common, maybe quite nice names. But for some people, it does, in certain countries, obviously, as we say, those who write the history books often write the street names, right? So if you live on a street that's named after, an old king or an old emperor, sometimes we can say, maybe tell something about the part of town that you live in, or when that street was built, or when these names were changed. That can say a lot about you. Even if you're local to a place, you often have an idea of who a person is by their street name. So in my town, for example, in North Carolina, the names themselves wouldn't mean anything to an outsider. But I can tell that's the posh part of town, or that's the part of town where there were more African Americans living. I'm African American myself. This is the part of town that's associated with the university. This is the part of town that's associated with new immigrant communities who are coming in.
Yeah.
So I think almost anybody can kind of close their eyes and look at the place where they grew up, and kind of map out, in a way, people according to street name and address in some kind of rough way. And then, of course, for the very elite, living on Fifth Avenue in New York is going to mean something to a lot of people, or living on Park Avenue, because there's a reason that they're fancy. People want to live on fancy streets because they want this connected with their address, and people pay a lot of money for those glamorous addresses. So yeah, so in a way, you can actually often tell a lot about a person from the address that they give on in the address book.
It's incredible how this little label became basically part of the identity of the
Yes.
inhabitants.
Yes.
And that's also it's very fascinating, especially that the audience of this episode, probably
Yeah.
there's going to be a lot of designers, planners,
Yes.
architects, also a very young audience. So I think everyone will start to wonder what were my addresses that I used to live at, what is the current address, and what does it mean.
Yes.
um, but I guess what is also very important to highlight, and what you already mentioned, that it's actually very huge privilege, because the estimation of people not having their address, it's like billions
Mm-hmm,
of
mm-hmm,
people
mm-hmm.
in the world. And it doesn't mean that without the address a person actually doesn't exist, at least for the government.
Yes, exactly. I mean, it's interesting because I knew nothing about this before I really started this project. And my assumptions were always that, oh, an address is great for mail, right? Like we just associate addresses with mail. It's a convenience for us. For mail, or, from having over somebody to my house, like, isn't this helpful for me? But actually, the origins of it are really much more connected with the government being able to find you. As I said before, we need them for taxes and banking, and they've become over time, over hundreds of years, linked to identity in this way. When you sign up for a bank account, you have to give your address, and it's not so that they can visit you and hand you your credit card. Not only do they need to send you things for the card, but that's the way we established identity in general in the modern world. And so the state really, because they wanted to be able to see their citizens, to control their citizens for better or
Mm.
for worse. This includes signing kids up for school and tracking disease, but it also includes drafting people and taxing people and um, quartering soldiers in early days. There were reasons that they wanted to know who was there. So the origins of it really are about government. So when you don't have an address, not only is it inconvenient not to get mail, your mail often, in one of the chapters, one of the early chapters of the book is about Kolkata in India, and there are these slums. I don't use that as a derogatory word. That really is sort of the legal name for what these places are, sort of squatter neighborhoods, really. The mail would be sort of dumped in a community center, which means a good chance you won't get it. You can't actually link it to your identity. It's not useful for the bank to know this community center. There's no privacy oriented to it. Anybody could come and get and see your mail, presumably. So it does become something that you really need to operate in the modern world. And we see that especially for probably your audience, which is a lot of designers and architects, is when we're dealing with homelessness. It's a huge problem. So when we talk about people who don't have homes, and this is one of the chapters in the book, we're often thinking, well, what do they need? They need a house, they need a home. But actually, you have to start almost even before that, because you need an address to do so many different things in order to get a home. So you need it to get a job. Technically, for some places, you don't need it, but actually, there's such huge discrimination over the homeless that if you list a homeless shelter or list no address, it's hard to get a job. It's hard to get medical care. In the UK, where I live, the National Health Service communicates almost entirely by mail. In my experience, they're moving somewhat towards texts, but in general, you have to get letters. You have to have an address to register with a doctor. You have to have an address to get a bank account. All the things you kind of need to set yourself up in society require an address. So yes, you need a house, absolutely. But almost beginning at the beginning, what you really need at the start is an address. So it does become sort of a huge privilege to be on the map, to be on the grid and to be able to be seen by the government and other institutions that can help you in the modern world.
Yeah, especially that maybe in the beginning, talking about the slums in Kolkata in India, it doesn't seem like the most important challenge that the inhabitants of the slums areas are facing, right?
Yeah,
There is
absolutely.
no sanitation, sources of clean water, and the house which is falling apart, or like, yeah, the idea of that that we speak about the addresses, that this what can make a huge impact
Mhm.
on their lives. It seems a bit, yeah, out of
I
nowhere,
I
but
totally agree, and I was really surprised when I started this project to come across this NGO that was doing this in India, and I thought exactly the same thing. Why not improve sanitation? Why not do all these other things? But again, it is almost beginning at the beginning, because first of all, as I said, there's quite practical benefits. So, for example, getting a bank account, this NGO has been able to link these addresses to banks, so you can get a bank account. And even though these are very poor people, everybody in some sense in the modern world can benefit from a bank account, right? Like storing your money under your mattress is never a good idea. So just access to banking, access to credit, as I said, access to mail and private deliveries. This is all hugely important as a step. It's sort of hugely important as a step to getting people out of poverty. But there's also sort of this civic idea behind it. So people actually really want addresses because they want to belong. They want to belong, and they want to be counted, and they want to be included. And
Mhm.
where I'm from, a lot of people talk about going off the grid. I'm not sure if that's a term in Polish, but um, I think it's really off the electricity grid. You go out into the woods where you can't be found, but I like to think of it as also off the address grid because, but there's a privilege in not wanting to be found, and so there's a certain spiritual element to this, in that people actually want to be counted, and they wanted to be found, and they wanted to be numbered, because they want to be included, right? I mean, I often use the analogy of money. If you lost your wallet, you could probably say how many bills you have, how many euros you have, say, but you wouldn't notice the cents, right? You wouldn't notice all those pennies. And in some sense, when you don't count things, you're saying it doesn't really matter. So people want to matter. So I remember one of the early conversations, I believe it's in the book, I had was with a South African voting official who's Black. And we were talking about addresses, and he said that his cousin had an address, and he thought that was very glamorous. And I thought that was such an odd word to use for an address because it's not glamorous, but it meant that he was living in a place where people counted,
Mhm.
this idea that you were living someplace else. And in India, there's also another practical element to people that people are aware of. So in India, you have all of these slums, which are largely squatter settlements. They're sort of settlements on land they don't own. And India as a whole has been very interested in getting rid of these slums and squatter settlements. And in return, people who live there are supposed to get housing. But the problem is, if you don't have an address, then you have no way of identifying where and how you lived. You just sort of become a person. So people saw that if they have this address and they have their name attached to it on a record, they can later say, look, you raised my slum, I'm entitled to housing. Because there have been lots of reports of people not getting, because of corruption, really, other people getting the housing that was intended for them. So not only could they stake their claim to a bank account and to the benefits that they're entitled to, but they could also stake their claim as to where they used to live if their slum is ever raised. So there's quite practical elements as well. But people did want them, at least the ones that I spoke to.
I think the one that really want to move out from the address grid,
Yeah,
they're very exceptional, and there are still way more people in need to get
yeah,
the address rather than
yeah,
the crazy ones going
absolutely.
to live in the forest.
Absolutely. Which is an instinct I can understand, I mean, it is a bit, I talk about this a bit in the chapter on West Virginia, which is a rural state in America, not too far from where I grew up, which is there were people who didn't want addresses, right? When they came in, this isn't even that long ago in America, when the addressers came in there, people said, I don't want that. And people thought they were ignorant, right? Like, oh, they just don't want change. But no, they understood what was going on, right? Like, not only could they now get an ambulance in their door, which was the reason for the addresses. I mean, it's hugely important, but it meant the police could also come, right? It meant the tax man knew where they were. It's not neutral. I mean, sorry, it is neutral. It's not all positive. It's not all negative. It's complicated. The benefits, the pros and cons of having an address, but obviously, I tend to see more of the benefits.
But for a moment, back to still to back to Kolkata in India,
Yeah,
it
yeah,
was
yeah.
also the part in your book that why giving the addresses to inhabitants of the slums might be quite controversial and questionable.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few different problems with it. First of all, at least the way it was being done when I went, and this was years ago now, 4 years ago now, 5 years ago, it was being done by a private NGO, which has now handed over quite a bit of the work to Google. So these aren't, it's not in the same way that most addressing works, at least at the moment, through the local government going in. So there's always slightly a problem with getting a separate addressing system from one part of the city to another. Does it really count? Is it really the same thing? Even if it does allow access to all sorts of things like banking. It's always, I always find it slightly problematic when companies like Google do these things. I mean, it's open data, what they're doing. It's on their own dime. It's hugely important work. But it does pull people towards Google products and things like that. And it always makes me slightly uncomfortable. I mean, it would be much better in my mind if the local government could do this more systematically, more local knowledge, use the same system. But, it's unable to do that or unwilling. It's hard to say. So we kind of have this sort of separate system. It's also interesting, and it goes back to my previous point about West Virginia, that when we were there, at some point, I went with the addressers to this sort of, it's hard to describe what it was. We went to go see one of the local government officials. And she was kind of what they called it. It was a nighttime meeting where she was kind of doing her homework. And I think the idea was that during the day, she sort of does her official business. And at night, she sees her constituents. She sees people that she has to serve, stamping papers and writing letters and signing things. And they had come to ask for her permission to do this addressing in one of the districts. And she wanted to speak to me, which was like, completely confounding because I was just there to watch and I was really anxious. And I said, I had this stupid question. I think I said, like, oh, what do you think of addresses? Not the kind of thing I had thought of in advance, but it actually turned out to be a great question because she said, well, there are a lot of criminals in that area, and this way we can find them.
Mm-hmm.
And it was really interesting because the presentation that these amazing NGO officials had given were about all the benefits that I've said about, banking and improved sanitation. You can and improve census taking and tracking kids for school and all these other benefits. And yet, she, from the state's perspective, saw it as a policing measure, which is valid and fine. But again, it shows that we've got it's a bit more complicated than simply saying, "Yay, we're doing this for people." And not that I'm against policing, but it adds a completely different element to the state being able to see into places that they haven't been able to see before. It becomes a more complicated move.
Exactly. We can describe a lot of benefits and threats, but also those benefits and threats are changing regarding who are we talking about, from which perspective are we seeing the issue, the addresses. And there is, of course, this discussion. It used to be, maybe sometimes it still is. It used to be, especially when the addresses and the house numbers were introduced. I mean, the issues of the privacy versus the issues of safety. It reminds me of the discussion of the in internet that we have currently, like how much our private data can be revealed. People had the same thoughts about the house numbers, that it really is like label on your house that everyone can find you, and it just no privacy anymore.
Exactly. And it's a really good analogy to digital privacy. Yeah, exactly. So when they started, it's hard to note one specific time in the book. I sort of talk about it as sort of this 18th century phenomenon. But yeah, of course. I mean, imagine. I mean, you're living in a place in a village that you know who everybody is, right? But the state can't really do anything with you. And to be honest, the state for a long time hasn't really been that interested in what they can do with you specifically, right? As long as there was tax money coming in, maybe some men to fight the wars, they didn't really care what you were doing. And you kind of like it that way a bit, right? It's very threatening when the state comes in. And so you have this privacy, you've got this home, this whole home that's your refuge. And suddenly they want to put for the public, for everybody to see, and to link you with where you live so that people can find you easily. I mean, at the time, it sounded bizarre that people fought against this and attacked the addressers and, ended up going to court over this and protests and, but when you put it like that, it makes a lot of sense why people would not want to be identified in this way. It does rip off a shield of privacy that people had. And now, again, we see this as a benefit. And in fact, people very quickly, even in places like Austria, where they became, or modern Austria, where a lot of this happened. I imagine Poland was also one of these early places. They came to like it, right? Very quickly, they forgot that they used
Hmm.
to like this, and we see that, I guess, probably in the modern age as well. That very quickly we're forgetting that we used to be such private people, because we see the benefits, right? We get things like Gmail for free. We get WhatsApp for free, right? And similarly with addresses. Wow, we get letters delivered to our door. It's really easy to tell people where we live. Everything's so organized. Oh, look, we can make proper maps. Oh, this is great. So very quickly we sort of forgot about the complications, I think, in the origins of house numbering and where this really came from.
We can commemorate also a lot of
Mm.
people, a lot of
Absolutely, and
heroes.
exactly, and that adds another layer to it.
Yeah, nowadays maybe we can see how a lot of street names are changed in terms of the Russian attack on Ukraine.
Yes, of course.
The Lithuanian capital, the Vilnius, has
Yeah.
given the Russian
Mhm.
embassy the new address of
Yes.
Ukrainian hero streets to protest against the invasion. Like, how meaningful is the function of this
Yeah.
political statement
Yeah.
and symbol of the protest in street
Oh, it's been
addresses?
so interesting to see this recently. It's not in the book, but I wrote a separate article about this, which is that this is the way states get revenge on each other. And this is a really long history of changing street names to anger another one. And you would think, why do they really care, right? Like, why do we think this works? But it actually turns out states really care about their reputations. It's what they have. I mean, they really fight hard for their branding, and we don't think about that. But there's been a lot of research about how states want to be seen in a positive light by the residents of another state. So it's long been quite common to, for example, Washington D.C. has, but for a long time, the street named after where the Russian embassy was is named after a Russian dissident who was murdered. There are always calls in American Congress to change street names. There's a very crazy story about New York, actually, that's not in the book, but it's about Nigeria. So you have Nigeria at this time was run by a dictatorship, and they ended up the dictatorship murdered the wife of a political figure. And back in New York, activists who were trying to help encourage the ousting of this regime, they named the street in front of the Nigerian consulate after her. Her name was Kudera Abiola, and they named that. And as a statement, exactly as they're doing in Ukraine, to say, like, look, we're naming it after this person you murdered, and every time you walk in the Nigerian consulate, you have to see her name. And the Nigerian government went absolutely crazy. They sued the city of New York in court. They had protesters that brought out in war, in big fights at city council meetings. Wole Soyinka, who's a Nobel Prize winner, spoke at these meetings. All the mayors spoke. It became this huge thing. And in Nigeria, actually ended up changing the street name to the American embassy after Louis Farrakhan, who's a complicated American black American figure that because they thought it would anger America, right? So you wouldn't think they would really care, but governments actually really do care, and I think we're seeing that now with all of the huge push to name streets after Ukrainian heroes, for example, because it's one of the only ways that people often have to try to fight back against the reputation of an oppressor.
Plus, the confirmation that it matters is
Yes.
definitely that it triggers later a huge discussion, like in
Yeah.
the New York
Yeah.
example.
Yeah.
We also had this. It was a petition to change the main roundabout in Warsaw, Poland, into women's rights roundabout in order to highlight and honor the efforts and the struggles
Oh,
of thousands
wow.
of women with social
Sure.
inequality. The change of this name was also one of the symbols of the women's strike in
Wow.
Warsaw
Yes.
that followed the ruling of the constitutional tribunal and so on,
Yes.
especially on abortion right. Yeah, you might think it's just a change of one
Yeah.
name of roundabout, but of course, we also remember in Poland and Ukraine,
Mm.
it was the process of decommunization, denazification
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
street names. So these changes represent and say something about the political status
Yeah.
and society, what the society is fighting for.
Yes.
It's incredible, but it
Yeah.
can be also a propaganda tool.
Yeah. Yeah, it can. I mean, and going back to your point about, I didn't know that about the Warsaw Roundabout, but it's fascinating because one of the benefits of this is that it gets us talking on a local level about all sorts of things you wouldn't necessarily talk about. So in the book, I talk about it in America with streets named after Confederate generals. And these are generals who fought for slavery in the Civil War. And you'd have people. And so, this is a debate we hear about in academia and maybe in school, but rarely do people at a local meeting stand up and talk about the history of the Civil War, right? And I imagine the debate in Poland was something similar. Like maybe, people talk about this, but when you actually start talking about street names, it becomes very local and people locally get engaged. And even if there are arguments, I like the arguments. It's good for us to have arguments about these things, right? We should be always talking and arguing and thinking about these things. So that's good. But exactly as you say, it can then become a propaganda tool as well, and what's propaganda and what's not. But it's a brilliant propaganda move. And the chapter in Berlin, I write about how the Nazis understood this, best of all, that one of the very first things they did was start changing the street names, because obviously you use your street names and you say them a lot. And most of the time, you don't even think about what the word means.
Mhm.
It's not like you're constantly hearing, after a while, Adolf Hitler Street just becomes sounds, right? It becomes almost embedded in your mind. So it becomes a very effective way. And so there were many, many streets changed then, but all over as well. There are places, I believe it was in Vilnius, that one of the main streets has been changed, names have been changed 5 or 6 times in the 20th century. There's just every single time a new regime comes, their way of asserting power is by changing the names.
Mhm.
And then a new regime will come in and they'll change the names. And this is even more important when I think sometimes when there's internal strife. And I was talking to a sociologist once who was explaining it to me this way, that, when let's say when there are Germans sitting in a French cafe, it's pretty, German soldiers in a French cafe, it's pretty obvious to everybody that the Germans have come, right? But it's a bit difficult in times of revolution because it's not always clear who's on what side and who's on another side. And so since you can't take the space from the outside in that same way, you have to take the space from the inside. And the way of taking the space from the inside, of claiming this land for your new regime, is to change the names. Because you won't have that obvious shift. A lot of times, a revolution, it doesn't look as different as it did before, at least in those ways. So then it becomes even more important to change names. But then once that regime falls, or once public opinion has changed, then again, you start to get these debates over whether the name should stay the same.
Yeah, but as you mentioned, debates and especially arguments are
Yeah.
very important in
I
that
think they're good.
discussion.
Yeah, it always comes up. Not always, but in America, it often comes up. You have contentious street names. People can't decide,
Yeah.
and so they say, "Well, look, let's just number them." Right? Numbering streets is a big thing in America. Let's just call this, first street, second street, and third street. And nobody wants that, right? Like it never works because people actually want the arguments, right? Like they want meaning. People crave meaning. So this idea that we'll just give them these neutral names, or we'll give it, Lemon Street, Strawberry Street, Apple Street, or something. No, people actually want the names to mean something. And like I said, like these arguments, they divide communities, but they also create communities. Like that's how we figure out what we're all about, arguments and all. So I actually find it really important, these kind of local debates.
Yeah, that's fascinating because from one perspective, like this repetition,
Mm,
subconsciously repeating street names, it
yes,
really is later stuck in our minds. It
yes,
creates the memory
yes,
from that place.
yes, of course, of
But
course.
then you mentioned we also have the other systems of naming
Yeah,
streets,
yeah,
the numbered streets in American cities. I think everyone can recognize and remember certain streets in
yeah,
Manhattan, in this
yeah,
very famous urban grid, and this is the city web and the street layout. And yeah, besides this pragmatic and very rational
yeah.
grid, what consequences did that decision have in American cities?
Yeah, that's an interesting. That's an interesting question. Yeah, so I mean, there's a chapter on on the grid on numbered street names in America, partly from my own experience as an American living in London for over 8 years now, and coming to Europe and noticing that none of the streets were numbered, and noticing that so many of the streets, almost every major city in America, has at least some aspect of numbered streets. The numbered streets are the most popular street names in America. And yes, and the history of it very much was, intriguingly, it was really introduced by an Englishman, William Penn, who came over and founded the state of Pennsylvania. He was a Quaker, so Pennsylvania was not named after himself, but his father. The king named after his father. He was very humble. So some of it had actually quite humble origins of doing exactly what we were just talking about, but not using propaganda, not honoring people and men, but keeping things very simple and rational and humble and modest. And so he began in his city of Philadelphia to number the streets, and the cross streets were nature names. So part of the idea, and this spread across America, partly because it was seen as being very modern. It was very easy. I mean, think about how big America is, right? So we're going surveying millions of acres and cutting them up. And what are the easiest ways of doing this is to do it rationally. And again, it really was seen as a rebuke in a lot of ways to the European ways of kings and queens and lavishness and aristocracy. It was seen as being something simple and very American. But you don't. Again, it has a lot of consequence. The cities in America are, I think, more rationally laid out for the most part, especially the further west you get. You get these sort of more rational cities. So I think some of it does dictate a little bit how American cities feel different. So cities like Boston, where I also spent a lot of time, even though part of the city it does have a grid system, most of it feels quite European. It's very old. So again, you have these sort of windy streets, but a city like Salt Lake City in Utah, very rational grid. And it can be very easy to navigate that way. So you do see that change, and you don't quite in those places with numbers obviously get the same debates over what a name means.
But then it means that it's supposed to be a bit no emotions attached, let's say, and no big arguments over the street names as well. But then we
Yeah.
are in Manhattan, and there is
Yes.
a huge fight over the addresses.
Yes.
So why does it really matter if the building will gain the Park Avenue address instead of East 121st
Yeah.
something?
And again, this is exactly so. It was designed, the grid and numbers in a way were designed to be quite rational and equal, right? And probably the most famous gridded city this way is obviously Manhattan. And so yes, it was designed to do that. And there's something quite beautiful about it, right? Like there's a great quote from an immigrant to Manhattan, which made the point that one of the beauty of this grid and the beauty of the American grid is that you are free from the state. There's no big church. There's no state church. There's no monarchy. It's equal, and that is beautiful. And there is something really powerful about it, because obviously the beauty of Paris was only made possible through extreme poverty. When we look at these cities and we admire them, we're also admiring, like, problematic doesn't capture it, right? A traumatic system of theft and debauchery. I mean, but we now admire that, right? And so by not having that, there's something quite beautiful in having given up that, even if you don't get the sights of Paris, if that makes sense. So you would think in Manhattan, you would have the same sense that, like, this is all equal and there's something very beautiful about that not mattering. But of course it matters deeply. I mean, first of all, having a number doesn't mean it can't attach a feeling to it. So Fifth Avenue in theory should be numerable. I think everybody knows Fifth Avenue is one of the fanciest shopping streets in Manhattan. But what was interesting to me when I did Manhattan is that a developer can petition the city to pay to have their building on a street name that they don't actually live on. So that the building doesn't actually sit on. So you have buildings that have a Park Avenue street address, but they actually aren't on Park Avenue. They actually are maybe not hugely far, but some distance from Park Avenue. And there are buildings like this all over the city, many, many buildings like this. It used to be very popular particularly when New York was really struggling and aiming to get money and aiming to get people back into the city. It happens less now, but it still happens. And to me, the most amazing thing about this is that these buildings are hugely expensive buildings, right? Like the apartments in there are millions and millions and millions of dollars, right? Famous people live in all these buildings, and yet they still cared
Hmm.
that they lived on Park Avenue. I mean, you've established yourself as being in this, limestone, mansion, and yet the developers know that residents still care enough about their image that they still want to write on their packages that they live in Park Avenue. I mean, I feel like that's just so much about capitalism and human nature. There's so much in that
Yeah,
because
marketing.
obviously it's
Yeah.
marketing, like how powerful that is, even for these people who are wildly wealthy. They still want you to know, even just from their address, how wildly wealthy they are. And it works. It works. It's worth the money to do this for
It
the
just might be a
developers.
bit confusing maybe when
Yeah.
searching for it,
Yeah.
but
Oh,
still
yes,
it's incredible.
exactly. If you have a stroke and an ambulance can't find you, then you might regret it. But yeah, I mean, this is, and again, I thought this was kind of a modern phenomenon, but it's not in New York. A lot of the street names in New York were changed on purpose to make them sound classy.
Hmm.
This was something people were doing in the 19th century. They were changing street names because they wanted them to not sound like the horrible shantytown neighborhoods that they were. I shouldn't say horrible because there's a lot of texture in these neighborhoods, but the very poor shantytown neighborhoods that were there before, they wanted them to sound elegant. So, and they didn't want them to become, Pig Lane, because by use, Pig Lane. So they created these beautiful sounding names. I mean, Central Park West, what a name, right?
Yeah.
I mean, they come up with these things on purpose. They made the name fancy, and then later the street becomes fancy.
I guess a lot of architects or designers can relate to it in a
Yeah,
way that a lot of developers creating
yeah,
a new residential
yeah,
building, they will name, yeah, as Sunny Valley, building development,
yes,
or
yes,
and there is Paradise Park
yeah,
residential
exactly.
area where there is, yeah, quite far from Paradise and quite far from
Exactly. It's all
the
marketing, but
park.
people like this in general, and then you also get the cultural nuance of what people think is fancy. So in London, for example, there are parts of London now. I talk about in the book going to see this fancy new building that was on, like, it's called Bootmaker's Court, which is exactly the opposite, right, of like Paradise Park. But there's a certain London feeling that these older names, it's something very cool about it. This was like a cool neighborhood. It sounds old and interesting, and then that becomes fancier than Paradise Park, right? Because I live in this older, even though there's nothing gritty about these buildings at all, they're really beautiful. They really embrace any kind of local names. I mean, it's quite cool to live on Pig Lane or something, because that means you lived in this sort of old bit of town. You don't live in
Yeah,
this new,
with the
faux
historical
shiny with
relation.
a historical relation. Even though they would when it was named Bootmaker's Court, none of these people would have wanted to live there, right? But now it has a certain cachet to it. So even these things, even what sounds fancy, changes all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I really would like to still grab the topic of the perception of the city and how
Mm,
the addresses actually influence how do we perceive the city and the
yeah, yeah,
space and the
yeah.
buildings and the space in between the buildings and
Yes,
so
yes.
on. Do you think we would perceive the cities totally different without the addresses?
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think we probably would see the cities differently. I mean, certainly the way we navigate would be differently. And the way we navigate can often be the way we see things, right? Like when you're in a place that you don't know, I think you do tend to notice certain things because you're looking for landmarks and things to pin you down in the river. You're not just looking down at your phone and listening to the names and navigating that way. Definitely. I mean, the way this comes up in the book most is when I talk about Tokyo, which is a city that's designed very differently from most Western cities. It doesn't really quite have the downtown in that same way. And the addresses up there are very different than they are here. So, whereas in most of the quote unquote Western world, for lack of a better term, we see things as streets. We have streets that are named with numbers along it. In Tokyo, they actually number blocks. They see things as a block, and they number the block. And even the house numbers are given fairly randomly within that block. They aren't quite as rational. I think often they're given according to when a building was built. In Tokyo, famously, obviously builds buildings and tears them down much more quickly than in places like London, for example. So these change more rapidly. And interestingly, it does seem just to be that people who live in these cities see their cities differently. They do see them in terms of blocks rather than these lines and streets. So their image of the city and the way they see it is quite different than I think the way we would see our Western city with such a huge emphasis on the streets rather than on area, so that will be different. But in terms of navigation in general, a lot of your listeners who are architects and know more about this than me might be familiar with Kevin Lynch's work, where he talks about the design of the city, and he maps cities out in a different way, like by what he calls nodes, which are landmarks, or edges, which are neighborhoods. You have waterways. You've got certain paths. He sort of breaks down the way we navigate when we look at a city. And some cities are really imageable because they have all of these things. You're just in there and you can see, you can navigate, you can look around. There's rivers, there's edges, there's neighborhoods, there's everything you can see. But there are some cities that are completely flat and blank, and there's nothing imageable. There's nothing that makes you able to see the city in a one part of the city doesn't really look that distinct from another part of the city, etc. So even without street names, your navigation systems in both of these two different kinds of places, these very imageable, vivid, bright, in Florence versus a small gridded city in America, they might look very different.
Yeah, we draw up this mental maps subconsciously, maybe even. Well, we don't really think what we are looking at, but naturally, well, maybe urban planners already thought about it
Oh yeah.
way ahead, and then this is how we navigate.
Yes, absolutely.
About the navigation, it was
Mm.
also very interesting that apparently we are getting very lazy with our GPSs in our phones, in our hand. We
Yeah.
don't really think where we are exactly going. We are just repeating the same route to the
Exactly.
office, for example, and so on, so on. Apparently, it influenced how developed the gray matter in the brain is.
Yeah, there's some scientists, I mean, really brilliant scientists working on this all the time about what GPS in particular is doing to our brain. And they're finding, yes, that most people are becoming the parts of their brain that are responsible for navigation are weakening when they use GPS. They do this through studies. It's hard to capture, but yes, and in general, that wouldn't be, in my head, a huge problem because GPS and phones aren't really going away. The problem arises is that the same part of your brain, the hippocampus, that governs navigation, also governs memory. And so there's this question of what are we doing when we're making these parts of our brain flabby? It may have other consequences, not just in the way we navigate, in the terms we see space, but in terms of memory. And memory and place are very linked together in our minds. I say, when you think about memory, it's often a very visual thing. There's
Mhm.
always you see something and a memory comes back to you. Or when you think back on memories, or in the book, I always talk about every film has a montage scene, right? Where there's a romantic comedy and the couple's just broken up and she walks past the bench where they first kissed and she sees the ice cream restaurant where he proposed. And, because it's very place-based, our memories, it's one of the ways that we capture it. So the question is, and I think this is what scientists are trying to work out, is the growing flabbiness of our navigation skills also going to affect the other parts of the brain where things like memory live? So I don't know.
Yeah, but this is very
Yeah.
fascinating. Also, the topic of you mentioned Tokyo, Japanese, and it was also the topic of how the Westerners and Japanese perceive the cities differently,
Yeah.
and that it can be influenced by the language that activates different parts in our
Yeah.
brains.
I mean, it's just a theory, but I think it's a brilliant one by this urban designer named Barry Shelton, which I encourage everybody to look up his work. He wrote this really brilliant book called Learning from the Japanese City. He's English. He lived in Australia for a long time. He now lives in Japan himself. But he has this theory, and he had this theory based in part on thinking about writing. So when he was a boy learning how to write in England, as my children are, he learned to write on the line. You had this, everybody, I'm sure it's the same. You have this beautiful lined paper and you write on the line, and your teacher says write on the line, whatever. But when he talked to his wife, who's Japanese, she didn't have that paper. In Japanese, it's an area-based language. It's character-based, right? There's no alphabet. Well, there is some alphabet in Japan, but in large, we're thinking characters, right? And so the writing paper is boxes rather than lines. But interestingly, as I said before, that's the way a lot of people in Japan see their city. People in Tokyo, at least in particular, see their city. They see it as boxes. Remember, we were talking about they address by blocks. They see things by blocks rather than by streets. And so he was thinking, there's a lot of evidence that our brains work differently, that the way you read a character-based language is different from the way you read a line-based language. So, for example, there are children who are dyslexic in a line-based language like English, who can read Japanese fine, right? Because it's different parts of your brain. And one of the ways he illustrates this is how people see their cities differently. Is he says that he'd ask somebody to draw a map in Tokyo, which is very common because it's harder to navigate when it's before GPS in particular. But the person drew the landmarks first and the buildings, and then he drew the streets to connect them. And he thought this was total madness, right?
Mm-hmm.
No American, no English would ever do it this way, right? You draw the streets, you draw, and you can't see it, but I'm sort of mapping out the street, drawing some streets. And then you'd plug in, on this corner, there's this, and this corner, there's that, and this corner. And he sort of used this as sort of anecdotal evidence of how people are seeing their space differently. And he also talks about how, don't talk about this as much in the book, but how signs in Tokyo are very area-based, right? And Japanese can be written up and down and left and right in all sorts of ways. And so when you see the signs, one of the feeling of disorientation as a Westerner going there is that things aren't on lines and they aren't as tidy as we think of them in the West. They're just written in this more area-based, and that this is reflected in the way their cities are operated. It's a beautiful theory and a beautiful book.
Yeah. I don't know if you ever imagine the world without the addresses and everyone then is sketching the landmarks and the corners and the blocks.
Yes, there might be something to that. Maybe we'd see things a bit better. I don't know. Again, it's always complicated. You do wonder. I mean, I walk in my neighborhood, and as you said, I'm walking on a route. I'm not seeing anything, but it's always fun when I have somebody visiting me in London who starts to see things differently, or I'm pointing things out and I notice, oh yes, look, there's that tree. And they're like, oh, look at that little cafe. I'm like, oh, I've never noticed that before. Because when you're in it, it's one of the reasons why travel is so refreshing, right? Because you're in a place that doesn't have these imprints of memory and habit and routine. You're able to see things. And if you move there, because say you love Paris, and you move there, you might become quickly very boring because you suddenly get into your habits and your routines and you aren't seeing with those fresh eyes. But I think it's probably one of the reasons people love travel so much. They want to be in a place that's somewhat that's a bit disorienting, right? Because there's a pleasure and a thrill in being disoriented in some way.
Yeah, but of course, it's also possible to even discover our own neighborhoods just with taking different roads to the supermarket, to the office. We just tend not to do it.
And I feel like during COVID, there was more of an emphasis on this hyper local.
Yeah,
I think people did get to know their neighborhoods more because you didn't really leave them, and there were a lot of movements in my neighborhood to do little things on the corner, or to because you get to know your neighbors more, and you're not really going places. Or for example, where I live, it's very common in London to have lots of what we call corner shops. Just tiny little shops everywhere. But for the most part, they tend to be a little bit more expensive. I don't really go into them as much. I tend to go to the bigger stores or order groceries. But because of hyperlocality, I started to go into these tiny little shops, and often they were Turkish shops or they were just a corner shop again. And it really changed my whole view of the neighborhood. These shops that I never would have really gone into except for a quart of milk. I started to get to know them and see them, and they became really mapped onto my neighborhood in a way that I couldn't have named them, just some random shop. So I wonder if that was one of the silver linings of COVID, that maybe we got to know our local spaces better.
It was also incredible that you published your book, and then I think it was just before the COVID or in the beginning of COVID.
Yes, at the very beginning, yeah.
Then you could observe all of these changes.
Exactly. No, it's been fun to see. And weirdly, there's a chapter in the book that I worked on. There's one of the earlier chapters that I wrote that's on epidemiology and how we use street addresses to track disease, and talks about that in cholera. But obviously, we see that in our own lived experience with how space and disease are so tightly connected during COVID. So that was really interesting to watch.
And so I can imagine that was maybe the topic that was mostly discussed, and that's the biggest observation after these 2 years after
Yeah.
the publication.
Yeah.
Do you have any other topic that you research even more, or it's the loudest, discussed?
Oh gosh, let me think. There's so many. I mean, good things keep coming in waves. So obviously we've got the epidemiology. We have the revenge street naming, as I talked about with governments.
Yeah.
Revenge street naming. Oh gosh, I'm trying to think. There's constantly things coming up. I mean, one of the big things that's happening even more. I touch on in the book, but it's happening even more is these political renaming. So I've long for years had Google alerts for the news for street name changes, and
Hmm.
that has completely blown up in places like England. There are many, many more discussions about names that otherwise seem neutral. So we're not talking about Lenin Street, right, or Stalin Street, like the really obvious ones, the ones that are more subtle.
Hmm.
So one example is of street name they're changing, which I talk about in my book, was that when we were house hunting in London looking for a house, I saw this house I really liked on a street called Black Boy Lane. And I'm Black. Uh, and I just thought, oh God, I just can't live on Black Boy Lane. And I was really surprised that it existed. But then I spoke to the people on the street who were standing outside when I was looking at the house. And they were like, oh, it's just kind of a name. And nobody really knows where it comes from. It could be chimney sweeps, were black faced, or there was a king that was once called the Black Boy King. There was a pub called the Black Boy. And nobody was really that bothered by it, but it really bothered me. And we didn't buy this house. But they're now changing that street name in London just this year. And it's incredibly controversial, right? Because there are people, even Black people, saying, you know, this is nothing, this is not offensive. And there are other people saying it is offensive because, to an American, the reason Black Boy Lane sounds, I had to explain something to my husband who's Irish. He didn't really see that being racist. But, is that in America, the term boy is a pejorative term, right? Like you would call an old man, a white person might call an old Black man boy because it's
Hmm.
like, you wouldn't call them Mister. It's a sign of disrespect. But there wasn't necessarily that connotation in England, though in colonial days, there'd be a boy, an Indian boy who would help you out, even if it wasn't a boy at all. And so again, we've had just an explosion of conversations about these topics that I think far more than what I discuss in the book, that it's become a pervasive part of city planning now to look at names and street names and decide, which ones reflect the community's values and which ones don't. And it goes back to a point that you made, Claudia, which was that you said, like, in Poland, people are, getting rid of communist names, but in a way, you also have a personal association with that name. So, and I really felt this when I was looking at Confederate street names in Florida. So there's a general called Robert E. Lee, who was a general for the Confederacy. So in my mind, I mean, I'm Black. My ancestors were slaves. I mean, this is a terrible man, a terrible person to name a street after. At the same time, I had some sympathy for people who were testifying about the name. And what they were saying is, some of them were saying, I don't care about Robert E. Lee, right? I would never have supported him during the
Hmm.
war. But look, I got married on Lee Street. I brought my children, my babies home from the hospital on Lee Street. My father was born on Lee Street in the house that he built. Everything to me is Lee Street. In my name, that name is connected with my family and my heritage, apart from Robert E. Lee, right? And so I'm not saying that's a good enough reason to keep the name. I mean, I don't think like nostalgia is a very good reason to do anything, but you see how these names become so embedded in us that it becomes about much more than the person that they're named after. That we do get these association with the name, so that this explosion of renaming, especially in America after George Floyd, really brought on a lot of these feelings.
Yeah, yeah, and it definitely confirms that it's not such a black and white decision that, okay, we get rid of some colonialism associations, communism associations, we just change, that's it, end of story. There is always deeper history, deeper story, and connection that people might have. Or
Absolutely.
like with the Black Boy line, I can
Mm,
imagine, like, a lot of people didn't even think that it was just a sound, like you
of
mentioned
course.
before. It's
Of
not a
course.
deeper meaning, but at the same time, in many cases, it's good to work out the change, and maybe then create new memories with
Yeah.
a bit better street name. But yeah, we talked a bit of the cities, the space, the
Mhm.
cultural influence, the
Mm.
identity, the wealth, and marketing. Even there is many more topics, of course, that we could
Mm.
elaborate. You could elaborate on, but I would like to thank you so
Oh
much
gosh,
for
thank
the
you. I could
conversation.
obviously talk about this all day. Thank you for your interest in the book. It's a topic I didn't know much about, but I think has a lot to reveal.
It's a definitely fascinating topic, and I do recommend to the audience. I do recommend the book, Adresy, or the
Mm.
Address book by Deirdre Mask. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Claudia.
Thanks for listening to this episode. I hope that we will all be very curious and conscious about the stories behind the street names. I'm enhancing you to check out your own history of the places and the addresses that you've been living in. If you live in Poland, for example, it's a big chance that you've been living or you are currently living in the street called Polna, Leśna, or Słoneczna, which is field, forest, and sun or sun street. Meanwhile, if you are living in the Netherlands, it might be a chance that you used to live or you are currently living in Kerkstraat or Schoolstraat, which is Church Street, and School Streets, because these are the most popular street names in these countries. I have to admit that first I got the address book from a Polish publisher. Later, I got actually another one for my birthday, but in the end, I also purchased myself the version in English. So, guys, if I have 3 versions of this book, the recommendation is pretty clear here. Thanks a lot, guys, and I see you in the next episode.